want to talk about the many gaps that I think underlie the problems that we are facing in security. And given that really the number of devices and systems we are using is really only increasing, you know, at an enormous pace, I think it's time that we consider how to tackle those gaps. So I was slightly petrified, but also very delighted that the lecture is being relayed to several other locations, since when I joined UCL in 1990, the very technology we're using now is actually what we worked on then. So it's great to see something go into production, and basically my colleague John Kirkcroft, who together we worked together on this at the time with Peter Kirstein, Mark Handley, also who's a colleague of ours here. So it's actually nice when something that you worked on actually really makes it out into the real world. So that's what I was happily working on internet audio and video when a collaborator at British Telecom rang me and said, sort of like in a slightly sort of gruff voice, "You know something about people, don't you?" Yes. And it's actually Steve Marek who basically witnessed most of this in the audience. So he said, "Could you know, we have this problem, and could you just have a look at it?" And I said, "What's the problem?" And they said, well, the problem is that the accountants are complaining about the costs of the help desks that we are running to reset people's passwords. Just to give you an idea of the extent of the problem, when I started looking into this, the company had a call center in Scotland that employed 100 people who did nothing all day long but reset passwords for BT employees. They had separate call centers for customers and their password problems. So the accountants basically said, you know, the number of people you employ has trebled every year for the last 3 years. This can't go on. So this person who was basically in charge of security said, could you do a quick study and tell us why these stupid users can't remember their passwords? So everything you see following on basically started from this point. So with my PhD student, Anne Adams, another woman working in this area, we basically set out to investigate this, and we looked at both the problems within the company and the problems also we then, as a comparison, looked at another company, and we then also put a questionnaire out on the web. So this was 1996, and actually it was really surprising to see that after 2 days we had over 250 responses from people just out there on the internet. You know, there weren't the billions of people using. This was only the beginning of the web. And the free text boxes we had provided for people to put comments in were basically not enough. So people were writing reams and reams, you know. And what you could immediately feel was like how cathartic it was that finally they had an opportunity to tell somebody what a pain and what a problem this was. So when we reported back to the company, and ultimately when we wrote this up in the paper, we said actually the answer is really simple. These people, the people aren't stupid. What's stupid is the policies that you're trying to make them follow. Because no human can, without any particular assistance, have between 16 and 64 different passwords and 6-digit PINs. And not write them down, change them every month, which is what it was at the time, and make them really strong. It's just not humanly possible. And the other thing that in this paper, users are not the enemy, which is one of the foundation papers of the whole research effort in the area of usable security, what we actually pointed out in there, which I think is very often forgotten when people cite the paper, is that we pointed out just what the effect was on people's perception of the security and of their behavior in the company and of the warlike state that then existed between the security department and everybody else. And we basically pointed out that this is not healthy, is if you're trying to have effective security, you need to get everybody on board. So what's happened since then? From an academic point of view, you could argue it's been a massive success story. Usable security is now recognized. It's got a couple of conferences of it that are solely dedicated to it. Papers appear in the top tier, the so-called top tier conferences, both in usability, like CHI, in security, CCS, Usenix, security and privacy. There have been books. Several universities, both here in the UK and in the US, now have specialist modules on usable security. And there have been many research programs and grants in both in the US and here in the UK. And it's also increasingly, there's now a whole community in Europe researching on this, which is now so big that basically it's got its own, it will, as of this year, have its own dedicated European conference. So you could argue from a research point of view, you know, that's been a fantastic success. But I'm somebody who went into research because I like solving problems that are out there in the real world. And if I look at what's happening in the real world, then it's actually not such a fabulous success story. I mean, with the kind of stuff that's been proposed by the research community, you know, it's really sort of like really goes from the sublime to the utterly bizarre. Yes? So the papers that are being published, including in these top-tier conferences, include authentication via Rorschach ink blot tests. You know, those things the psychiatrists basically say, oh, what do you see in there? Singing your password at the computer. Thinking your password and measuring EEG. In fact, I always used to make really fun of this, and now I need to slightly pull back a little, because with the emotive helmet, where you can directly control, you know, which has become a consumer. It was originally built for disabled people to control computers, but because gamers are really, really interested in shaving, you know, seconds, as many seconds as possible out of the interaction, it's turned into a consumer device. $300. And if you have a bit of patience and train the thing, you can actually control your interaction with it. So maybe actually this is not so ridiculous as I thought. But what is ridiculous is schemes that like Microsoft had invented and tried, where you have to register and you get codes which you give to 3 of your friends. And if you lock yourself out of your account, you have to ring them up in the middle of the night and go like, you remember that code I gave you? You know, that's months ago. I need you to go and log in and, you know, and type this in, and then it will give you another code. And if you give me that code, then I can go and reset my account. Yeah, really. And of course, the other thing that's happened is biometrics. You know, a lot of the stuff is very, very dubious, and I keep like, you know, there's really now hardly any body part left that's not being covered, that isn't allegedly unique. You know, we started with eyes and fingers, and now we've got nose, ear, whatever, you know, and various other things. And actually, ironically, the one that's really working and really widely used is, of course, butt recognition in cars, you know, built in luxury cars to not only to recognize the user and overcome the immobilizer, but also do something really useful, which is to adjust the car to exactly the person that's driving it. It remembers your mirror settings and your seat positions and so on. So when you get in, you don't have to bother with all that stuff. We'll come back to that kind of security, which I actually think is much more useful later on. So, but in terms of products, you know, little of what you actually see in that literature has made it out into products in the real world. What we get in the real world is things that, from a research point of view, are really quite, you know, sort of like you would call this like pop psychology or pop science. So people go like, oh, pictures. Surely pictures are easier to remember than words. And so a lot of these alternative products basically are based on pictures, and on this solely, it's quite amazing, really solely on that. Somebody says, you know, oh, I know enough about psychology, you know, surely pictures are easier to remember than words. And then we go and build a whole product on it. And in the case of the product on the right-hand side, you know, if we are lucky, we can also sell this to some government departments who haven't read the security science behind it, that basically says, and I exaggerate slightly here, that it's quite possible that a 5-year-old with an iPad could overcome this in a zero-effort attack, but later on. So in terms of products, well, the banks have been hard at work to make things more secure for us, and they've basically produced this whole bunch of hardware tokens, so no doubt several of you will have used that here. And the feedback that we've been getting, and also the feedback that the banks have been getting, is largely their customers hate it. Right? Because the reality is most people have multiple bank accounts, and the idea of basically juggling multiple tokens and multiple different rules for, if I use this bank account, I have to use the token every time I log in. If I use that one, it's only if I'm paying to a new person. If it's the other one, I only need it if it's over £5,000. And, well, people's memory is still limited. And that's the message that doesn't seem to get through here. And now what's basically happening is an absolute stampede to shift the whole thing onto the mobile phones, right? Because even though banks had invested a lot of money into it, they've had a lot of pain in terms of people leaving because they said, customers leaving because they said, I'm not doing this, it's too difficult. And so they say, ooh, have you tried this app on the mobile phone? And so that's where we are going. And now combined with a fingerprint, everything should be fine, right? It's very easy to do. You can't forget your fingerprint. Hanky-dory. That's where we're at this point in time. What that's going to look like from a security point of view, we'll see. End of the year, next year, we will see. Because I think that's actually one of the things we can say here in practice. There's not been a very good loop between the academic research and what's happening in practice. And so what you see is really what's happening in practice. They're just adding, sort of like looking for another step or adding another layer, reacting to problems that they're seeing, either because of certain attacks that are coming in or because their customers are complaining. And I mean, arguably, I would say they could have saved a bit of user testing and market research right at the beginning, could have told them that the tokens they were rolling out and every bank having a different token for the sake of marketing and branding ultimately isn't a good idea. If you go to Norway, the government said, sit down, here's a security standard you've got to meet, and you've all got to come up with the same. It's got to be the token that you issue to your customers. It's got to work in the same way for every single bank. We're not going to tell you how it works, you can figure it out, but make sure it works exactly the same way for every bank account. That seems to have been a very, very smart move. So the irony is, of course, is that most of those solutions with the token, now you have the token and there's various things you read off, you still had to have a username and password. So really all that's happening is you get more and more work layered on top of this as far as the user is concerned. And again, what seems to have passed a lot of the service providers by is the fact that more than 50% of text entries and more than 50% of passwords are now entered on touch screens rather than a keyboard. So the problems and the pain, so memory, not being able to remember different passwords, that's one part of the problem. If you fail 2 or 3 times before you get it right, that's another part of the problem, right? That basically means suddenly it takes longer. And when you're entering the same 8-character password on a touch screen, the time that it takes is about 3 times longer, and the error rate for entry goes up between 3 and 5 times. Right? So it's basically small wonder that people are going like, no, or that if you give them a policy that allegedly makes the password secure, people end up very quickly converging on a small number of passwords that comply with the policy but only require 1 toggle between 2 of the soft keyboard screens. From a security point of view, that's a disaster. Right, because that small number of passwords is very guessable. Okay, so finally last year something happened that was truly astonishing. CESG, which gives advice to the government on security policies, revised the password policy. they issued this document called Password Guidance Simplifying Your Approach. And the very astonished response from a lot of the tech writers and people in industry was, that's so sensible. But a lot of the actual security community, the security professionals, had their various, had their issues with this document. What the document actually does is something that I thoroughly approve of, which is not a surprise because I had quite a large influence in actually it ending up in this place. That it actually says is, don't think about, you as a service provider have a responsibility. Whether the passwords actually work as a system or not is largely down to you, the service provider, and it's not about telling people to have longer and more complicated passwords, right? There's a lot of things you as a service provider can do to make sure that system is actually is working and works well enough. And if you think about, some of the companies that actually don't make your life so difficult, the ones with A and Z in the letters might be a good example here. They don't force you to change your password all the time. They don't tell you what your password should look like, right? They basically say, pick something you can remember. If it really is one of the top 10, we'll probably tell you not to use it. But other than that we'll watch your account. And if somebody's trying something funny with it, we'll probably pick that up and we'll deal with it because we have other security measures in place. And that's really what this document talks about. It talks about defense in depth. And it says, actually, a lot of the policies that are creating most of the pain for users aren't really helpful. So the idea that you should change your password every 3 months is one of those things they basically say, stop doing it. Because all it does is it creates a lot of pain for the legitimate users, and it actually then leads them, if you force them to do it, they'll end up picking simpler passwords. The evidence is actually there. Say to people is, pick a password that's reasonably strong, and then let them use it. If they're willing to create a strong password, don't expire it. Say to them, the sensible advice is, if you think you've done something that may have been suspicious, if you think you may have been phished, if there's any indication you have used a computer that's got malware on, that's the point when you change it. But just routinely expiring it, and forcing people to, in some cases, these policies are applied to all passwords, even in infrequently used ones. And in the work with NIST, we found a huge number of passwords that expired every 90 days, every 3 months, and people were only using that system twice a year. So twice, they actually sat there and had to come up with a password that complied with the policies and that they hadn't used before, that wasn't similar to one they'd used before, for absolutely nothing, right? And this is basically also what you'll find the advice in this document said. The advice is use technology. We have technology that used appropriately can take a lot of this pain away. You can give people one-time tokens that they can use for infrequently used systems, and that's a much better solution than trying to force all these policies on them. It's actually quite interesting that really part of what was regarded as heresy by the security profession is when you start taking apart of how really passwords are used and how they are attacked, you can find that this obsession with have a strong password is quite misguided, because it's solely driven by the idea of that there is what we call an offline attack, where the attacker manages to get hold of the password file and then throws lots of computing power at trying to crack it. So the first point here is this type of attack is only possible if the attacker can steal the password file. That is the first thing service provider should stop happening, right? Number one. A lot of them have gotten a lot better at that. But if the password file is stolen, then the question is, how was it protected? And the answer's been, like what you see on the next slide, is in quite a few of the major breaches recently, it wasn't protected at all, right? It's plain text. Various of the breaches like Sony, 30 million passwords, plain text, RockU, plain text, you're seriously standing there and it is just utterly, I go like, what planet are you on, right? Then in the security press, what's being discussed afterwards is, oh, look how many people have silly passwords. Like, password or whatever, right? Not to like, what is this company doing keeping 30 million passwords in a plain text password file, right? So, what basically our colleagues, Cormac Hurley, Joe Bono, Frank Strajano, Prof, and Oshut, who basically wrote a really, really seminal paper about this, what they pointed out is like, if you've actually protected your password file properly, then you should, you really don't, you shouldn't have that much of a problem. But also, a lot of these attacks are not offline attacks. So they're not attacks where somebody basically tries to steal the password file and works on it in whatever time they have available. A lot of the attacks are what we call online guessing attack on the live system. They basically try and feed live passwords in. And when you're dealing with that, actually in only 2 of the major leaks that happened, there was an offline attack. All the others that were online attacks. So depending on which kind of type of attack you try, the password that is good enough is actually for an online attack. Surprisingly, the password can be surprisingly simple. So if you just use 4 numbers, that's probably not so great. But if you use a combination of a simple combination of letters and numbers, like Tin Can 24, that actually is good enough to withstand an online attack, provided certain combinations of security measures are used by the service provider. I just basically keep it at this high level. I mean, for those of you who know more about it, like things like throttling, locking accounts after a certain amount, or so on. If you use those things, that's it. And what actually pointed out in this paper is this phenomenal gap between the password that is good enough to withstand an online attack, something like Tin Can 24, and if you're really worried about an offline attack, well, actually, you need to go and have a password that is like that one at the bottom, the right-hand bottom there, right? Which is something that if you try to enter that regularly on a touch screen keyboard, I'd be worried about the screen because you'd probably end up throwing the device. And actually that started this whole discussion about what actually really is buying us how much security. And it turns out we can actually make things easier for people and still have a pretty good level of security. So here's the first of many gaps I want to highlight for you in this. So just this week, basically it's very clear that finally after, what's been nearly from my point of view, nearly 2 decades, that things are finally changing, So the advice is now is basically don't just keep saying the same thing to people, which with an increasing number of accounts and devices is becoming pretty impossible. The other part is like, let's just use the technology to take care of this problem of recognizing people, right? We actually have so much technology. We, after all, we're tracking people all the time. We know where they are. We have, we log when they're logging in, and we can basically capture biometrics without them having to do pretty much anything about it. Well, sometimes you may have to hold the phone. If it's selfication, you may have to hold the phone up and sort of get your face into the frame. But that's already one of the more effortful biometrics you could, So just using the sensors in the phone as you're walking, and that's really where things are going now. So to continuous authentication, not bothering and not interrupting the user. So finally, with authentication, we seem to be getting somewhere. That's great. But I'm still going like, did that really have to take? Why did it take 20 years to get to this point? We knew in 1996 it was a problem, and just the urgency of really doing anything. Was it the lack of urgency to do anything about it, or what's actually not happening? So this question actually exercised the U.S. government, certain of the U.S. government agencies quite a bit. And so they ran a consultation with various industry bodies and researchers where they said, so how do we make, usable security happening? Because actually, DHS and NIST do understand that, because they read the kind of research we have produced, is that if you make things too difficult for people in terms of security, you end up with security, with ineffective security. Or even if you try very hard and actually enforce things on people, you end up damaging the productivity so badly, which is really a sort of, which is also very undesirable if you're trying to have a thriving economy. So they said, well, can we please look at, what are the companies actually doing who are developing these products and services? What are they actually doing to make sure the security measures are usable? And I worked with a team of several US colleagues on this. And it was, to start with, in the workshop, there were all the big companies there, and several of them basically were thumping the table very confidently and said, yes, we do usable security, and we talk to our developers about it, sort of like one of them starts with an M and the other one starts with a G, and they were very bullish about that they were actually really doing it. So then NIST said, we've had lots of requests from medium-sized companies to say, we need some examples. We need some examples about how to do this. So NIST said, okay, here, basically, this team of researchers, we commission you to study the processes in the companies that manage to produce usable security. And then we can use those as examples for everyone else of how to make that happen. So, well, all the big ones who basically thumped the table and said they were doing it refused to be studied. But we did, in the end, manage to study 3 companies which said, which were also very confident that their security was usable. And we took a really, really simple approach. We said, let's discuss one particular product that you think is usable. It's secure and usable, both of these things. And please, we just asked very simple questions about who set the goals, who made the decisions, and we asked a really simple question like, how do you define security? And what steps do you take to make it happen? How do you define usability? And what steps do you take to make it happen? And so how is usable security? Is there anything, like when you try to bring the two together, that needs to be done and happening? Okay, so we studied 3 companies, A, B, and C, in this basically in this time frame. It's a multidisciplinary team of software engineers, security specialists, and usability specialists. So it's 8 of us in total working on this. And we had a total of nearly 220 pages of transcripts from those interviews. Not all of them, we actually discarded a few of them because they actually then, we had somebody in the room and they wanted to talk about a totally different product from the one that we were studying. But it actually took us a lot of time to get these agreements with these companies and then to actually get the developers and their managers and the business leaders into the room to talk about it. So one was a large technology company that provides, including very high-end security software to US government. The other one was a large international company in the finance sector that is very, very technology savvy and always invests a lot in. And the third one was a large company that develops lots of software, including security products. So in the first case, the product we were studying was a remote access, secure remote access. In B and C, it was both an access control system, including the reviews to be that companies have to carry out to demonstrate they're compliant with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So essentially, it is tools that allows the responsible person to see who has which access permissions and can then, approve or remove them. So in Company A so when we actually then analyzed the interviews, we really had quite a shock. We didn't actually expect it to be, in a sense, to be this bad. So in company A, basically the most frequently association was between usability and luxury. Right? They were all talking about security is essential, security is our business, usability is a luxury. So they had their mental model was very much from like we have, there's a security level we have to achieve. If we're developing, if we're basically reviewing a product and creating a new version, whatever, that security level must not go down. If we change the usability, we'll as much as it is allowed. So that was the model they had in mind. They had no criteria for it. Basically, when we asked what are your security usability criteria, they did have a process for security. So they basically had extensive peer review of the specification going several levels up and down the company. And then it was like, when nobody could think of another attack that could succeed on the system, then it was deemed to be secure. In terms of the usability, they didn't really do anything. That the product would go out, and then one of two things would happen. There would be reports of people having to be dismissed or disciplined because they had circumvented the security of the product, or the cost of running help desks was so high that they basically said, guys, you've got to do something about it. We've got help desks, didn't we have that already? So I'm going, not that much progress on where we were. So that was company A. In company B, basically the problem was they couldn't get the managers to do these access reviews. Because essentially, if you're a manager of 50 people, you look at all the access permissions they have. Thousands. Right? And most of the cases, so you get like the name of the system, the name of the person, and the managers would largely go like, what am I even looking at? That is a system we have? I'd never heard of it, right? Very interesting. But, that's what the policy says has to be done in the name of security. And basically the managers would go like, I'm too busy, I'm not doing it. And that put the company in non-compliance. So the pressure came from the top is make this work, give them a tool that makes them do these access reviews. And they tried to do something, but they didn't really involve the users in the process. So they didn't actually sort of sit down. The greatest change usability change they made was instead of ticking all the access permissions, to confirm that they could be retained by the individual, they made them pre-ticked because it's less work to remove. But if you then ask the question, so the security goal is to remove any access that is no longer needed. Do you do any checking? So we said, like, what's your criteria for how many rogue access permissions do you think is still okay? And they said, like, well, as long as they whack the people who are outliers in terms of one order of magnitude, we're happy. From a security point of view, that's sort of like, think about this. The mind boggles. Right? It's really. So in terms of usability, as I said, after then it wasn't their revision wasn't really accepted. Then they said, well, we tried to change some of the language of it. And then finally, actually, some of the managers stepped up and made a suggestion. And he said, well, I don't really know what all these systems are, but my staff who have the permissions know what they are. Couldn't we ask them to actually review their permission on a monthly basis and just voluntarily give up the ones that they don't use anymore? And guess what? That basically reduced, first of all, the number of permissions the managers had to review went down less than basically over 50% on a monthly basis. People voluntarily just said, I don't need this anymore, and removed it. And you suddenly went down. So here, basically, where is one of those examples where it goes, it's like this focus on, somebody has to check and somebody has to enforce, and not really involving the people who actually know most about it in it, with this kind of, I think it's driven by this ingrained idea is you can't trust the people who have the permissions, right? And that actually underlies, that drives, unfortunately, a lot of the thinking And that often leads to the unusability. The other thing that I thought was highly ironic is that the development team admitted very cheerfully to basically not following any of the company's policies during the development of the product. That they basically just, nicked various bits of equipment from elsewhere. They did testing, some of their testing on live databases, and various kinds of things. And they basically went like, well, if we followed all the policies, we couldn't get it done in a sharp time frame. So, go figure. Right. Company C. So here particularly, they had a product, which was also this access review product, but they developed it and they were selling it to other companies. And it gotten a very bad review from one of the big review consultants, starts with a G, that basically put it in the dreaded bottom left-hand quadrant, whereas all people want to be in the top right-hand quadrant. And so they then said, okay, basically G says, this product is terrible because it can't be used. We must do something. We're losing sales. We must do something about it. So they hired a bunch of usability specialists, but they gave them very few resources. So the usability specialists were never able to actually visit the customer companies. They managed to speak to some customers using WebEx and doing some walkthroughs and testing, but it was really quite painful, also not least because really in most of these companies, the relationship between the customer and the company is owned by the so-called sales engineer. And they guard that relationship very jealously and don't really like these, pesky usability people coming in and then maybe, admitting to the customer that something in the product isn't, wonderfully great and, it could maybe do with some improvement. So the other part was that the developers fought them all the way. So the usability team went through the various methods they produced. Here is the changes make it easier for somebody to understand. And the developers went, nah, we're not doing that. We've built this product. We know lots of things that are wrong with it. We have our own agenda of what's important to fix. And they didn't make any of the usability improvement until basically somebody in the usability team who could also code effectively slammed the code in front of them and said, here it is, just put it in. And they went like, you can code? Usability person can code? We thought you just draw pictures on the screen. So basically then these things were implemented. It was a success in the sense that the sales improved, and the usability people said, yes, but we still have this list of other things that needs fixing. But the company said, doesn't matter, sales improved, move on, we'll move you on to another product. So if I say, we were sort of like a bit shocked about this is we had not expected to find that none of these companies had any criteria for usability or security. They had no way of actually measuring or comparing anything. They had no formal usability testing, very little. I mean, if you take peer review and consensus, until I can't think of another attack as a security criterion. They had really no formal security testing either. That was surprising. But the other part was this all-pervasive myth that there is a trade-off between usability and security. That something that is secure is, if you want something to be really secure, it can't be usable, and that it's okay. And this is the underlying mental model that really is quite, is the toxic thing that really stops progress from happening. And they're basically going, sort of like, don't make my problem any more complex. Train the users. We'll come back to that. There's basically, when we ask them, there's really no understanding about the impact this had on productivity, the impact it had on basically, so the customer companies that aren't doing the reviews are not compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley, right? That puts the company in a difficult position. They could lose, lose their license. That really nobody really in the developer team made that connection at all. And arguably none of the people who were managing them really had framed the problem properly for them. So lots of room for improvement. So I think it's actually really tragic that that we're in this situation, because it wasn't always that way. I always say in ancient history, so a lot of, a lot of our security is based on cryptography, and the founding father of cryptography had 6 principles, August Kerckhoffs, right? But what Kerckhoffs was doing is he had a very clear focus on who would have to operate this system, right? He basically says, I'm providing a system where generals communicate secretly, across, so when the enemy gets hold of it, they shouldn't be able to read the marching orders we are giving and where we are moving. And Kerckhoffs looked at, he is the kind of soldier who will have to carry the thing and who will have to operate it. And he came up with 6 principles for secure operation of encrypted messaging. And in bold is 3 of those principles were usability principles. Right? So he was very clear about that. It has to be principle 5. System must be portable and shouldn't require more than one system. Okay, that's one we've probably cracked by now. Great, but the other 2, it must be easy to communicate and remember keys without requiring written notes. Easy to change or modify keys with different participants. This is one of the real key struggles we currently still have, to make that easy. But also the final point, regarding the circumstances in which such a system is applied, it must be easy to use and must neither require stress of mind nor the knowledge of a long series of rules. Right? If we could just all get back to that, right? If that was, those are the criteria that we really need to put in front of the designers and developers is my argument. Right? That if those are we need to translate that principle into concrete criteria for any new product and security mechanism that is designed. At the moment, we're not setting them any constraints, and guess what? Then if you don't set any constraints that way, or at least companies that aren't very consumer focused don't set those constraints, that's what you end up with. So what we get instead is this misguided thinking. It's the people who are faulty. And we must fix them. So, the people are just ignorant and lazy. They're not doing the things we're telling them to do. So, and technologists see fixing the human as a cheap option here, right? Because it's only training, right? It's only because they have no concept of people's time and the fact that people might have other things to do. It is literally, I remember that when we had the discussions about this number of passwords is too many, changing them that often is too many. And they went oh, couldn't we train people to remember passwords? Can't we give them some training so they can somehow cope with this memory problem? And the answer is yes, we could do that. There's a little book out there called Moonwalking with Einstein. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's the story of how somebody trained himself to become a memory athlete. The name is Fur, and he then participated in the memory Olympiad, and I think he came 2nd or something. Right? So I said, yes, basically we can do that. If you can give all your staff a year off so they can basically do this training to become memory athletes, then they can juggle 64 different passwords and change them every month. And also, but even if we did that, they would still spend about an hour a day just rehearsing to do this kind of does that make economic sense for the company you're running? And the answer is no, of course it doesn't, right? It's absurd. But still, that is the reflex. Go oh, can't we just give people some training? No, well, human factors is not about being nice to people. Human factors is about getting the best possible performance out of people. And you get the best possible performance out of people and out of a person that's using technology. 90% of it is fitting the system to fit human capability and limitations, and 10% is new skills that the human has to learn. Right? If you're basically diverging too much from that 90-10 rule, you're heading for trouble, and you're heading for systems that either will be circumvented and or create huge economic damage within the company. So this is and the problem is, if we just keep throwing stuff at people and say, shouting about like you ought to be more secure, it's counterproductive. So here's an email I got a couple of weeks ago from somebody at the Information Assurance Advisory Council. The BBC have just launched a guide aimed at the general public on how to spot and avoid internet scams. The guide's been compiled in association with the London Police and GetSafe Online and contains an easy checklist of warning signs to watch for. Can you see the first problem with this message? I thought it was just my email client. No, it's pretty much everybody's email client flagged this as a scam email. Right? So you're sending out something to tell people about security, and your own technology tells you it's a scam, right? Then when you try and go on, you get a warning, ooh, you're really sure you want to go there? And then when you go to the website, basically this is what you see. Would you fall for a scam? 5 signs of actually spotting it. Yes, fear, despair, that's really what we want. And here are your top 5 tips. Online scammers want your cash. Each year, more than 3 million people lose hundreds or thousands of pounds when they become victims of scams. How does this help me to do anything? You're just scaring me, right? I mean, you just basically, what actionable advice on how to spot the crime am I being given here? Not really. And I go to the second point, ripping you off, and again, we're throwing more statistics at people about how bad things are. And then, maybe here, citizens advice bureaus stop scams. So, okay, I have to click on another link. Ooh, am I not being told not to do that? That's dangerous, right? So, but I'm feeling risky, so I'm going there. I'm sorry. I mean, this is just a mess of gigantic proportions, right? You're asking people to be interested in something, to spend their time on something, and that's what you give them. I think this is just abominable, right? And but this idea is, let's just throw more information at people, right? And that will fix the problem, rather than actually thinking about is what actually is the problem. So all you're doing is you're compounding an impression that most people out there already have, which is, this is a joke, right? Coming back to the first paper, users are not the enemy, that's exactly what we were saying is so toxic and so counterproductive. You're trying to get people to be interested and engaged and saying like, okay, so what's my part in this? What it is that I should be doing. And these kind of efforts really achieve exactly the opposite, and we can't do that. What we need, the opposite is, yes, we need to change some security behaviors. People are doing some things that are risky and they shouldn't be doing. But we shouldn't just basically do this. There's this trumpeting. It's like we've really got to engage, and part of engaging is listening to them about what are they worried about, what are their questions, and targeting the information that we're giving at them in a way they can understand. But secondly, also making sure that what we're telling them to do actually is from evidence, basically provably good advice on how to keep secure. And I think that's where we're really, really sort of being stuck. Go to any of these websites, whether it's GetSafe Online, Cyber Streetwise, why do we need all these different websites? Shouldn't there be one giving authoritative advice? Right? So we've got all these different websites, and what is their number one top tip for staying safe online, staying secure online? Oh, come on, you must have seen this. Have a strong password, yes. Which, that is the top tip, when actually what we know is that only a small number of passwords now are actually obtained in that way, and you should much more worry about whether they're obtained through phishing or through malware. And the top tip really is don't use a password that's for anything particular, that you read for assets you want to keep secure on websites out there that you don't know anything about, and that might not be very well protected. So we've worked on this. This awareness is only the first step. It's a white paper we co-wrote with HP Enterprise and with input again from CESG, which is directed at companies. And when we're saying like, okay, frankly, if you're just making people sit through annual sort of security awareness training, cheap online, where you just repeat the policies at them and make them do a multiple choice quiz. The research has been done. The results are very clear. This does not change anybody's security behavior, right? Just that the fact that some people know what some of your policies are doesn't mean they are actually following them, right? And that we're saying like security behavior change requires more than just telling people to do certain things. You need to help them change their behavior. Right. So first of all, you have to make sure the behavior you're asking for is actually doable in the context of the particular job or the particular activity that they're doing. So first question would be to ask, how much time does somebody have to spend doing this? How many steps are involved? What kind of memory load is involved here? You have to care about that to start with. But even if it is doable, to change from an established behavior to a new one, that's work, that's effort. And that is where you have to support people through to the point where the new secure behavior becomes a habit, and then it's not a super effort. So the details really matter that much. It's just to say, it's like, if you wanted to be compliant in terms of ISO 27701, it's just about giving people information and sensitizing them about the risks and make sure what the correct behavior is. But what we are saying is that's really only the first step. Changing the behavior requires engaging your employees and actively supporting them in changing that behavior and making clear and making sure it fits into what they're doing and so on. And that is, frankly, we've working with these organizational change specialists, drawn up a whole framework for it. The one thing this is not is a cheap option. Right? Organizational change, if you've been involved in any of these exercises, right, it's very hard to achieve. It's not a trivial put up a few web pages thing. It's a commitment. It's usually you're looking at a 2-year program, and you need to involve HR training. You need to get all your middle managers on board and you need to stagger it. You can't change 15 behaviors at once. You need to roll this out and so on. It's not a cheap option. So we better get back to getting our technology sorted out to make sure it's not that cumbersome in the first place. So I've been telling you about the kind of gaps I've encountered in my immediate research. So it's very clear we've got these gaps between developers and security specialists and usability specialists. But there are, having worked in the Science of Cybersecurity Research Institute, it's very clear that similar gaps exist between others. So one is between cryptographers, which are mathematicians really, and engineers. We basically had an event a couple of weeks ago. GCHQ hosted an event where lots of researchers from the UK came, and 2 of the PhD students of Nigel Smart basically presented this work they are doing, where they had a whole catalogue of products that are supposed to be secure, but are not secure because the engineer who built the system didn't interpret the cryptographic specification or proof correctly. They weren't aware of certain assumptions that were made by the cryptographer. They weren't able to check the proof, and so they've come up with a whole raft. And that's now a research program, is how do you actually figure, what are the questions that the implementer should be asking of the cryptographer, and what are the kind of assumptions you shouldn't let a cryptographer get away with, because you go like, I'm sorry, the real world isn't like that. This is not an assumption you can make to deliver a secure system. Other things are between security specialists and developers, it's actually one of the which is basically related to this problem. I don't know, you might recognize these warnings, right, that pop up, SSL certificate warnings, right? They plague us, and again, we've trained, billions of users to just go, right? And to not really take this seriously anymore. But, I mean, who, and I'm going like, who thought, it's okay to deploy something that has a false positive rate of 15,400 to 1, right? That's basically what we're looking at. So, I mean, no user in their right mind would pay any attention to this, right? But who really thinks it's okay to let this go on? Now some work is underway to basically change the setup and make it easier for developers to implement the certificate correctly. But for years, nobody really cared, right? If you then basically go and you have usable security people who basically run lab studies, or in Google's case, internet-wide testing studies with 10,000s of people, where they go like, "Ooh, we'll make that okay button, the go away button, much harder to find, and we make it look really ugly compared to the yes, okay, it's dangerous, so what do I do? So I can't do what I wanted to do." Or in the case of other teams, to basically go and say, actually, if you make the warnings different every time, you change the box size and the colors and the text order, and you change the text, then people don't habituate so quickly. They pay attention for the first 3 or 4 times, except for, just from the second time on, they start hitting the OK button. So forcing users to pay attention to something that is a totally misleading tool in the first place, I don't know. This is not right to me. But going back to a couple of other points so this is between security specialists and developers. Between business leaders and security specialists, there are also some, I think, some conversations that are not really happening. So when the Heartbleed, for those of you who were interested in this, like when the Heartbleed virus happened, right? So the story came out about how this is an open source piece of software that's maintained by 3 people who look after this part-time, and just one guy, silly enough, did it maybe in a bit of a hurry, and he committed a change, and yada yada, and everyone goes on about this. And I'm going like, okay, how many billions of dollars of business are built on this piece of software? Right? How many billions of dollars? Big corporations, right? And they're using this piece of software in what I would call an utterly parasitic way, right? Nobody thinks, maybe we should invest in this a bit, right? No risk manager of all these billion-dollar corporations flagged up that this might actually potentially be a problem or a vulnerability. Something isn't working here. That shouldn't happen. You're just basically taking the stuff and you're not really looking where it comes from. That's not supply chain security. I don't call it supply chain security. You really have to listen to them all. Regulators, I think so. The regulators in the Sarbanes-Oxley case, for instance, you must review access permission. I don't think they had the faintest idea what that really means in terms of on the ground, when people are doing agile development, when projects are being done, when you do app development and you do they have no idea. They mandated this, and it's an utterly dysfunctional mechanism. Right? Policymakers and those who execute policies, there's huge gaps, and I actually think, to their credit, GCHQ and the MOD here in the UK have recognized this, and they're now saying actually having lots of policies and very complex policy edifices is counterproductive. Having 400 different policies is, just to read them or understand who can read this, who can understand this. We should be giving people actionable advice, and we should be giving targeted advice, and we should make sure it's up to date, and rather than writing these big documents that sit on a shelf, and nobody really reads them. We're not getting more secure by doing that. There are many, many gaps that currently our efforts to deliver security that actually works for everyone involved falls into. And we really should sort of change strategy, I think. And some of these efforts are underway, and a lot of colleagues have realized this and are moving in this direction. So we should focus on evidence, right? Not theoretical policies, and just create, create more and more. We should basically be very ruthless, and things that don't work should go out, right? We shouldn't basically keep harping on so we should spend more effort on testing whether our advice is really working. Focus on outcomes, not theoretical principles. Yes, proving that things are secure is important, but it's got limitations. And if you don't actually test it in the context of where it is deployed, then it's basically false comfort to say, like, yes, I've got a proof. The problem is you've reduced the real-world systems to a model, and whether really that model covers all aspects of what matters is, that's something you cannot prove, not unless you do very extensive empirical work on it. We definitely need more collaboration and better communication between the different stakeholders here. I mean, clearly between security specialists and developers, but also the business people really have to join the conversation, and they have to realize that security shouldn't be a grudge sale, it's an investment, right? You don't sort of like sit there and go like, I'm not doing anything until I absolutely have to because a regulator or a policymaker tells me, you should be interested in safeguarding your assets and safeguarding your technology, and basically say, look forward, rather than sort of grudgingly, shelling out when somebody else says you have to. And really, we should have clear allocation of responsibilities in line with the capabilities of stakeholders. At the moment, there's still a lot of push the risk onto the person who doesn't understand what the risk is, or who doesn't have a choice. The big service providers, you accept my terms and conditions, or you can't have the service. We shouldn't basically tell people that make them sign terms and conditions that we already know from established research they can't follow, and we really need to give them solutions they can work with and they can cater for. So I think that'll keep us busy for another 20 years. Thank you very much.